I mean, yeah, ultimately that's what these videos tend to end up as. We only have so much real history to go off of, so the further you diverge from our original timeline, it just kind of gets progressively harder. You really just start adding fiction on top of more fiction. So then you need to dig even deeper in the real history to justify the scenario. It's an endless loop. You know what? That's true. Very true. Every so often I run into topics that could easily be a 10-hour documentary. And for the sake of time, some simplifications and omissions have to be made. Again, another good example. These videos are all about pacing, and if you want to play YouTube's game, pacing is everything. These videos kind of live and die depending on if people are still watching, so it's good to not just grind everything to a halt, all to explain the logistics of the project, or how Britain and Canada could have helped accelerate it. Yeah, there would have been slightly better clarification on the Manhattan Project, but there's a lot of information to get to. When you think about it, contextualization kinda has no endpoint. I'd rather make a 5-part timeline if I see the support for it, rather than a 1-hour series on the Manhattan Project, all to make a point. A lot of complaints in my older videos was how I would talk 90% about the history and 10% about the scenario, so for the sake of the scenario, sometimes sacrifices had to be made. Alright, on to the constructive criticism. We're gonna separate this by the British comments, Soviets, and nuking Berlin. Alright, you got me. I would like to make the first amendment to the video. The peace treaty was actually too soft. As a few of you pointed out, Germany would also want at least a few of its World War I era colonies in Africa. In hindsight, we can look at Britain's resilience, but at the time of the deal in 1940, a huge portion of the cabinet and populace just wanted peace. And since its official entry in the war in 1939, what did Britain actually manage to accomplish? They watched as Poland and Scandinavia were torn apart, they got utterly wiped out in France and Belgium. Strongbrew makes a good case regarding Germany's attitude to Britain here. On top of that, it's worth noting that Germany gave British POWs the VIP treatment, while committing numerous war crimes against the French, Polish, and especially Russians. Also, keep in mind that in the scenario, I did say Germany would gain access to the Suez, but they wouldn't own it. With the rising tensions in India and utter helplessness against the Reich, what could Britain achieve by refusing this deal? How would such a refusal affect civil order and troop morale? As for the alternate invasion in 1945, do you really believe that Mustache Man would call it a day and just live out his days in peace? What about Africa and the Middle East? The German war machine would be unstoppable, and would have a lot to gain from just finishing the job. Alright, so Operation Barbarossa. A lot of you disagreed on Germany winning due to logistics, and yeah, I get it, it does seem unrealistic. I try to explain why the logistics of Germany would be slightly better and why the Soviets would be significantly worse, but I get it. Alright, so while a lot of the actions of these states did come down to the orders of its dictators, things were also a lot more complicated than that. I don't think the Soviet Union, which fumbled against Finland in '39, would be too dramatically transformed if it was given a 300 days heads up. I don't really think this front line could be substantially reinforced against these panzer divisions, and a Luftwaffe on steroids. Say its front line was reinforced. That kind of just adds logistical strain on the Soviets, who pour in men and resources on a wider front further from its industrial base. Not to mention that in our timeline, the Soviets received multiple warnings from both their own spies and British intelligence of the impending attack, and they were in the process of rearming. Remember, the invasion in this alternate scenario would happen like a month sooner, and it's not a sudden full-out victory either. Like, it could take the Germans 2 years before they break the Soviets. You know, just like an estimation. This isn't science. Besides, preparation is a much smaller factor here. We're really talking about the lack or reduced amount of Lend-Lease that breaks the Russian bear. That's the main thing. With Britain unable to be the Atlantic middleman, American aid is kind of too little too late. And as a cherry on top, I want to highlight this comment from one of the modders of the ultra-realistic mod for Hearts of Iron 4. An alternate history video bringing up Hearts of Iron 4, groundbreaking, I know. I didn't really specify this in the video, I guess I should've, but there's no way the Germans go to Siberia, or hell, even the Ural Mountains. They wouldn't need to. The Archangelisk Astrakhan line he describes is where the Germans could safely park the bus, and all of that would be used to level up the Kriegsmarine for potentially Sea Lion in 45. 20% of the Soviet territory contained 80% of its population, and more importantly, its resources. What the Soviets beyond the Urals decide to do is irrelevant. Most likely they would just collapse into a bunch of warring states scrambling for control like in the Chernobyl and Lenin videos. Alright, okay, so this was the main reason I did the whole Q&A. A lot of people had a big issue with the fact I said an American bomber could fly all the way over German-controlled airspace and drop a nuke on Berlin while they were at war with Britain. And yeah, you're right. Kind of. You see, as impressive as the Manhattan Project was, Uncle Sam threw even more cash at the B-29 Super Fortress. It sounds crazy, but yeah, less money was spent to split the atom than to make a better plane. And I mean, it's a really good plane. This bad boy was Cold War era tech invented decades earlier. You know what? I agree. Nuking Berlin does sound a little far-fetched. We're talking about the heart of the Reich here. So let's go ahead and have the nukes drop on Hamburg and Cologne instead. They're within better range, they're not as well protected, and we're gonna just factor that into part 2 of this timeline going forward. Yeah, we're retconning, why not? A few of you also expressed doubt at America randomly nuking Germany, but remember that in the scenario, Pearl Harbor still happens. Germany still declares war on the US, so when Sea Lion begins, they were already at war for a few years. That was probably the first time I did a well-actually Q&A since I had like 1,000 subscribers. I'm going back to my roots. Going through the comments and discussions is always a lot of fun. As nice as real history is, I like fake history better. And man, we're deep into alternate history territory. A full 5 years after the point of divergence in the most well-documented and discussed era in history. So let's have some fun with it. Hey, guess what? Desk mats. That's right, elevate your gaming or workstation with Alternate History Hub desk mats, where history and creativity collide. These desk mats are perfect for anyone that likes stupid little figures inspired by history. So, the nice people at Epic Desk reached out to me for a collaboration. They specialize in high-end, premium desk mats that they promised would knock my socks off. I gotta be honest, I was skeptical, but after they sent me this one with my America design, honestly, I couldn't be happier. Like, man, it actually is premium. Crafted using a blend of polyester and spandex, it's built for comfort and durability, and this bad boy comes in 36.5 by 15.75 inches of smoothness. Yeah, you heard me. So because I like this one so much, I came up with a total of 4 designs that you can now choose from. You could put a map of North America on your desk, stare into the Codyverse, join the Jimmy Gang alongside a bunch of other figures, or maybe you just want to watch the world burn in the flames of World War II. Hell, you could get multiple, grabbing a neat 15% Black Friday discount on your whole order. I will say though, get them while they're hot, because these designs are a one-time thing, they're never coming back. These mats will only be available through January 1st. There are no restocks. Once they're gone, they're gone. You've seen stuff like this before, you're on the internet. What often happens in alternate history scenarios is there's a single idea or point of divergence that's investigated as a thought experiment. But due to popular demand, this will now become an entire timeline. The thing is now, with each step we take beyond the POD, things become more complicated, but much more interesting. For example, there are many theories out there about what would have happened if Spain joined the Axis in World War II. Taken at face value, this is an interesting scenario that ultimately leads to an even quicker Axis defeat. But in this Dunkirk disaster timeline, Franco joining comes along with a lot of other changes. Notably, that change happened off-screen. So before we return to the altered Cologne nuked 1945, let's catch up on the rest of the globe. How did Britain's exit from the war and fall of the Soviets in '43 affect the world? Ever since the 1848 revolutions, large waves of German immigrants constantly made their way to South America, a land which resembled their homeland, where they could raise cattle, climb mountains, and drink beer under the warm sun. by the time World War II came around, those communities had deep roots in countries like Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, affecting the decision-making of the states themselves. That being said, while even in our timeline a few hundred of them flirted with the idea of Axis alignment, the Atlantic, and more importantly, the metaphorical American gun to their heads, would easily dissuade them of such notions, leaving things, as for now, relatively the same in our timeline. Then there's Africa. With Britain out of the war, the North and East African campaigns just don't happen. In fact, with nobody to support them, Free France never gets established. A quick but very important aside. In the previous video, I said that peace would be obtained with or without Churchill. That goes without question. But Churchill's stubbornness does force him to accept the terms, with the glimmer of hope that he could one day reverse the fate of Europe. This means that Charles de Gaulle and other resistance fighters are given refuge and sent over to America. But as a whole, Vichy France retains all African colonies, as Africa awaits for Germany to light the candle in 45. Unlike the Great War, the Second World War really lived up to its name. This conflict encompassed the entire planet. Hell, there was even fighting over Antarctica. This was a time when everyone had to pick a side, especially in Europe. And sure, you look at a map and see there were several neutral states, but in reality, each of them was leaning one side or another. On the pro-Allies camp, we had Turkey, Portugal, and Ireland. Over on the pro-Axis camp, you got the SSS of Sweden, Switzerland, and Spain. The only country that does not change its stance on this timeline is Ireland. Everyone else hops on the Reich bandwagon. Sweden was already surrounded by Axis members, supplied Germany with over half of their iron, and allowed its troops to move through its territory on their way to Russia. Mustache Man really didn't bother integrating the Swedes into his coalition, since they were already giving him everything he wanted. Plus, he feared that their direct involvement would make them an easy target for British bombing. But in a timeline where they witness an expanded Finland, triumphant Germany, and pacified Britain, Sweden would be very easy to persuade. These same arguments would be very persuasive for the Swiss, but even more so than Sweden, they served Germany's interests far better as a neutral country, which was already towing the line. From the European perspective, after the fall of Moscow, the war was already over. In our timeline, many countries rushed to change their stance in 1944, when the writing was on the wall. Same goes here. For example, just look at how Franco changed his tune, and then how the West treated Franco in the name of combating communism. Speaking of the Spanish dictator, him joining the Axis would fundamentally alter the timeline. It's weird to think that Sweden was more helpful and cooperative to the Axis than Spain ever was in our timeline, but it turns out despite being bailed out during the Civil War, Franco was incredibly reluctant to return the favor. After the fall of France, he met with Mustache Man and started to haggle. His demands included vast amounts of food and fuel, which would restore the Spanish economy, French Morocco, Cameroon, and parts of Algiers. He even asked for mainland French territories, more specifically its Basque and Catalan lands. Finally, he declared that he would officially join the Axis only after those demands were met. A few years later, Germany once again tried to persuade him via threats and promises, just so they could move troops across Spain in order to attack Gibraltar, but he refused. Yeah, you would need a serious POD that changes Franco's mind. But luckily, that's exactly what we have here. In this alternate timeline, in order to get his captured soldiers back, Churchill is forced to cede Gibraltar to Spain, and Malta to Italy, as outlined in the last video, effectively losing British power projection in the Western Mediterranean. This on Germany's part would be a very generous gift, buying the allegiance of both dictators. Furthermore, Franco was terrified of the British, but with them being pacified, they become a non-issue. Perhaps there's the sweetener of French Morocco to seal the deal, as well as substantial economic aid, which would only increase in the years after the fall of the Soviet Union. An Axis Spain and ever-growing German success would send direct messages to Portugal's own dictator, Antonio Salazar. Like Franco, he was a shrewd man who did everything in his power to stay neutral, reaping the profit from both sides. In this alternate world, Portugal Portugal would probably be forced to break its treaty with Britain and join the Axis in order to prevent a violent takeover, around the time Greece or Leningrad fell. In our world, Portugal allowed the Allies to use the Azores in 1943 for crucial bases. Here, that allowance is mirrored, granting the U-boats a base of operations deep into the Atlantic, long before the big fight in 1945 begins. So, in summary, the Axis is joined by Spain in 1940, Sweden in 1942, and Portugal in 1943, with a combined population of 41.6 million people, and the GDP equivalent of Australia or Argentina at the time. None of them had a particularly powerful military, but their manpower, projection, and most of all navy would certainly come in handy for the war to come. Oh yeah, there's also one other neutral country I haven't mentioned yet, the Republic of Turkey. The old man of Europe was revolutionized by the Young Turks, and now, a few years after the death of Kemal Ataturk, Turkey made the decision to remain neutral, as his right-hand man and successor continued with the reforms. Due to its strategic position, both sides made many offers, but the Turkish government was concerned by both the Soviet aggression and Italian dreams of a new Rome. That being said, the country had a zealous movement, believing in Pan-Turkism, hoping to unite with other Turkish-speaking people, particularly those in the Caucasus. In this alternate timeline, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Germany is now able to project power and offer a unique win-win solution. You see, the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan worked around the clock to provide the Union with 70% of its oil, and it was staunchly against the German invaders. They even mobilized 700,000 soldiers to the war effort, or a fifth of its population. German occupational forces were already stretched thin. So, in return for ceding the territory to Turkey, they might not only join the Axis, but ensure the oil shipments never stop. Insert blatantly obvious reference to Dune here. Speaking of oil, the more I research this topic, the more I'm stunned by how important this resource really was. Which, like, no duh, but still. For his birthday in 1942, Mustache Man even got a cake shaped like Baku. Ideology aside, so many wars are mainly driven to get key resources, and there is rarely a point in time when such a valuable resource is spread in such an uneven way. The closest second I can even come up with is how unfairly coal was distributed during the Industrial Revolution. Today, oil is produced all over the place. But in 1940, when the technology was still developing, you only had a few key sites: Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan, Venezuela, Mexico, Indonesia, and East Texas. Of the 4 locations in the Eastern Hemisphere, 3 were right next to each other, and Germany was planning to push forward from the Caucasus all the way into Iran and Iraq. Between 1948 and 1958, major oil fields would be discovered in Canada, Libya, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Kazakhstan, China, and the North Sea. That is partially why the UK and Soviets went crazy in our timeline, when they discovered that Iran had Axis sympathies, and they held anti-British protests. BP was drilling the hell out of Persia, giving Iran only 16% of the profits, and the mere threat of that going away was enough for them to launch an invasion alongside the Soviet Union. Just 2 months after Barbarossa, Iran fell within 6 days, and became the first nation to be split in 2 by the Allies, with North Iran going to the Soviets and the South going to Britain. Yes, this actually happened. A few months earlier in 1941, the exact same thing played out in Iraq, which supplied Britain with 40% of its oil. Just 2 years after obtaining limited independence, the young nation suffered a coup by a nationalist group which overthrew the pro-British government in the hope of attaining full freedom. The British response was swift, and the rebels were put down within a month. Now, in this alternate timeline, both of these events still occur, even with the German demand that the empire become more isolationist. Churchill could not afford to lose the Persian corridor, but at the same time, Mustache Man was too busy with Operation Barbarossa to do anything about it. After the fall of the Soviets, Iran's northern half would be overrun by the British, setting up the groundwork for a massive theater of the war, which the Germans would open up in '45. Right, so apart from some crucial allegiances being changed, the regions not mentioned in the previous video pretty much remain the same, but the Pacific Theater is the one that changes the most, at least until it all pops off with Operation Sea Lion and the nukes. Remember all those oil fields? Notice how only one of them was east of Iran. Not to mention, the Dutch East Indies produced 1/15 of the amount of barrels East Texas did. That strategic situation meant that after the 1941 oil embargo, if Japan wanted to keep their empire, they had no other choice but to attack it, and everything else that stood in its path. Looking back, it really is insane how much the West underestimated Japan. Japan still attacks Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Guam, Wake Island, British Malay, Hong Kong, and the Dutch Indies. Now, you would think that a peaced-out Britain would put up a better fight against the Japanese, but the truth is, they underestimated them just as much as America did. Moreover, non-aggression treaty or not, Britain would still fear German aggression, and was busy operating in the Middle East. The first wave would proceed the same way as it did in our timeline, but starting in 42, Lord Mountbatten would receive a lot more support in his operations in British Burma. It's an easy bar to beat, considering the British barely sent 2 infantry divisions in our timeline. In our world, the Casablanca Conference outlined several key issues for the Allies. Roosevelt wanted to build up China and aid it as much as possible, but Churchill put those plans on hold, prioritizing action in Europe. Since in this alternate timeline those actions were a far-fetched dream, Chinese assistance would be much more amplified, slowing down Japanese progress on every frontier. On the other hand, the looming German threat also means that Japan is treated more as a side quest, if anything, not worth wasting precious nukes on. Since the Soviet Union falls apart, those nearly worthless provinces in the Far East might be taken over by the Japanese, while the Allies commit their entire strength in defending off Germany. No Soviets and no concluded operations in Europe means no Operation Downfall, and no end in sight for the conflict in China. The Japanese have a much harder time in China and Burma, but America and the Commonwealth aren't just too busy to land a kill shot, buying the Japanese more precious time. Now let's circle back and examine the buffed up Reich and its opening moves. In our timeline, the Axis never had a shot, but given a few extra years of preparation and experience, on top of a defeated Soviet Union, plus a few more extra Axis members, and what you end up with is a very even fight. The Allies have spent the last few years preparing for the inevitable attack, but like the Japanese in our timeline, they didn't anticipate Mustache Man breaking the 5-year treaty 3 months before it expired, and attacking in May 1945. Crucially, the attack comes in just a month after the passing of FDR, giving Truman a similar test that Churchill faced in 1940. Provided with Swedish iron, Spanish tungsten, oil from Baku, and grain from Ukraine, Albert Speer is able to fulfill many of the ambitious promises to the Reich. One of those was the 20,000 aircraft, including many new models like the jet-propelled Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulf-Ta 152, who now made bombing runs over the English Channel. U-boats suddenly descend upon transatlantic shipping from the Azores, while the upgraded Kriegsmarine drill in preparation for Operation Sea Lion. Instead of being shipped away on Operation Paperclip, Werner von Braun's V-2 rockets are launched from occupied Holland in the hundreds. While London was getting battered, the Empire would be struck on 3 other crucial fronts. It's too early for the millions of Wehrmacht soldiers to board the ships, which is why 200,000 men with an ample supply and armada of tanks strike British Egypt alongside Italians and Spaniards. Lifting off from Crete and Anatolia, the Luftwaffe descend upon Cairo and Cyprus, smashing every port and airbase they could find. Malta is stripped away from the British, and within a month, the entire Mediterranean is dominated by the Italian Regia Marina. A month or 2 later, coastal Egypt is in Axis hands, which now prepare to rendezvous with the Second African Theater. So, stepping back, a lot of people like to trash talk Italy's military performance, but they might not have heard their actions or luck in the often forgotten East African campaign. Unless you play Hearts of Iron 4, then you've probably heard of it. Mussolini envisioned the capture of Egypt and Sudan, connecting his colonial empire. At first, they reaped some success in Somaliland, despite heavy casualties. In January 1941, the British initiated Operation Camilla, broadcasting false information, tipping the Italians off that they were moving troops and preparing to attack Somaliland. Instead, they were preparing to attack Eritrea by land. But in a stroke of accidental brilliance or luck, the Italians decided to let the presumed British land first, redeploying coincidentally to where the British were actually coming from. This resulted in the stunning and decisive success of the Italian army, which pushed the Commonwealth all the way back to Cairo. Yeah, that was a joke. Italy was crushed. Ethiopia was liberated, resulting in the first real victory for the Allies and the destruction of Mussolini's colonial dreams. And while we're at it, the Portuguese colonial empire too. So here's the thing, even in a timeline where the Axis powers were buffed up, against a more prepared Allied force, backed up by American troops, Italy still crumbles, losing their holdings in East Africa. More importantly, this is the first taste of combat in 5 years for the Commonwealth soldiers, and a good opportunity to practice their combined operations with the Yankees, something which will be very important in the theater that everyone had their eyes on. So far, we have one swift victory for the Axis in Egypt, and another swift defeat in Ethiopia. But that draw would be broken in the Middle East, where both sides could pour tanks, airplanes, and troops in order to contest for the abundant oil resources there. The Axis held Syria, Turkey, and the Caucasus, while the Allies could rely on the safe Indian Ocean to deliver their troops via the Persian Gulf. The wide-open floodplains, jagged mountains, and deserts of the region would become the key battleground, and the true trial by fire for the Allies, who would be met by none other than the Desert Fox himself. Only this time, he would enjoy copious amounts of fuel, allowing him to outmaneuver his enemies with ease. The other key advantage for the Axis here is the fact that for once, they were actually liberating occupied people who despised British rule. On the eve of World War II, America had only 439 tanks, and despite a ramped-up industry, island hopping and naval battles with the Japanese would do little to prepare the ground force for this campaign. That being said, the Allies had powerful tools in their kits as well. Logistics were easier, technology, especially in the air, was superior, and while the Germans had better officers, the Allies cracked the Enigma code. But it would take a lot of time for experience to be obtained. Time and a lot of dead bodies, as the German war machine plowing through the desert sands, western Iraq, and all of Palestine would fall to the Blitzkrieg, while advances in Iran would be more difficult. The battles in Africa, the Middle East, and all over the English Channel would be intense, and on each front, the Axis would have the upper hand. But then, in August 1945, Truman drops the nukes over Cologne and Hamburg, killing over 1 million people in an instant. After years of stockpiling, aircraft and bombs, both sides unleash all their fury across the English Channel. Spitfires and Mustangs versus Messerschmitts in aerial combat, which would pave the way for a naval invasion for one side or the other. Considering this is an overconfident mustache man we're talking about, the Germans would likely throw everything and the kitchen sink at the Allies. But for every plane the Luftwaffe takes down, America ships in 2 more. But Uncle Sam wasn't all muscle, he had brains, and they achieved their task at Los Alamos. Amidst the maelstrom, the B-29 Superfortress was able to nuke both Cologne and Hamburg, inflicting a major wound on Germany, while simultaneously turning it even more fanatical. Over 500,000 people are vaporized, raising the stakes. In the midst of the confusion, a major operation is conducted by the Allies, who seize all Portuguese territory in Africa. More importantly, a Pearl Harbor-level attack is initiated against the Azores, risking American aircraft carriers in return for eliminating the valuable submarine base. Action in Africa and Iraq convinces Truman and Churchill that the key to the war is hitting Germany's underbelly, namely its Italian and Spanish allies. If they could pull off a D-Day operation in Spanish Morocco, then maybe just maybe, they could win the war. But to answer that question, we will need a third and final chapter to this epic Dunkirk timeline. Thank you once again for all your support, especially to my Patreon members. This is Cody of Alternate History.
The rules of war.
Hey, 42 here. Robert Fleming Jr. was standing watch on the deck of a warship one evening when he saw a strange object in the water off the starboard bow. At first, he thought it was a log, but then he noticed the glint of what looked like metal. That was enough to raise his suspicions that turned to outright alarm when the weird metallic log started heading right for his ship. Fleming raised the alarm and everyone nearby carrying a gun opened fire on the approaching vessel. It was too late. An explosion shook the ship and 5 minutes later, it was gone. Sunk, as you may have already guessed, by a torpedo from a submarine. But this wasn't just any submarine, and the scene I just described wasn't just any old naval engagement. It was the first time in history that a submarine successfully sank an enemy ship in battle. But here's an odd question for you. When do you think it happened? If you guessed the First World War, then I don't blame you. It was during the First World War that submarines were first widely used. But the very first successful sub-attack took place a full half a century before Archduke Franz Ferdinand met his maker by way of an assassin's bullet. Robert Fleming Jr. didn't serve in the Great War. He was a sailor in the Union Navy during the American Civil War, and the ship he was serving on, the USS Housatonic, was sunk by a submarine called the H.L. Hunley 160 years ago, in 1864. The sinking of the USS Housatonic was a monumental moment in the history of warfare. But for the crew of the Hunley, the celebrations were short-lived. Shortly after the attack, eyewitnesses from both sides reported seeing a bright blue light in the water, a signal to shore from the Hunley's crew confirming that their mission was successful. It was the last trace anyone would ever see of them for more than a century. Because the history-making submarine never made it back to shore that night, and neither did its 8-man crew. In the decades after its demise, dozens of expeditions tried and failed to find the lost sub, and the fate of H.L. Hunley became one of the biggest mysteries of the entire Civil War. But in 1995, the wreck was found. 5 years later, it was painstakingly raised from its resting place on the ocean floor as the world held its breath. After more than a century of waiting, we were finally going to learn the fate of the first submarine ever to sink an enemy ship in battle. Or at least, that's what we thought. But then, things got weird. Displate is a platform for artists with thousands of creators from all across the globe sharing their unique designs, paintings, and illustrations on metal canvas. There are over 2 million artworks available in the Displate catalogue. Discover new original art or choose from officially licensed designs from the likes of Star Wars, Marvel, Elden Ring, and many other iconic brands and franchises. Displate has just launched a new product line called Displate Textra. They have tactile 3D textures, and they're now available across a vast selection of pop culture metal posters. I've just hung some Displates in my home and they look incredible. The print quality is the best I've ever seen and they just pop right off the metal canvas. It's tool-free, safe for your walls, and super quick. Each Displate comes with a magnet kit, so everything you need is right in the box. I could not believe how easy and quick it was to displate my Displates. Oh, and you can swap them out anytime in less than 10 seconds. I'm super happy with how my Displates look, and now you can get them delivered in 4 to 5 business days. And Displate is celebrating Black Friday. Now they are offering the biggest discounts of the whole year with up to 44% off your order. Also, for the first time ever, Textra designs will be discounted too. Use my link in the description. The discount code is applied automatically, or just use my code 42 to get the biggest discount of the year right now. Make sure to act fast, as it's not forever. and a special thanks to Displate for sponsoring this video. Before the wreck was recovered, the working theory was that the sub had sunk and the crew had drowned. But when archaeologists began studying the wreckage, what they found didn't seem to make any sense. When ships and submarines sink with their crews inside, a certain grisly pattern almost always emerges in the wreckage. The human remains are found clustered around the exit points. It makes sense. If you're trapped inside a sinking ship, there's only one place you're going to go. But the human remains inside the HL Hunley were arranged according to a very different pattern. The bones were found in neat little piles along the sub's interior. And that meant that every single member of the crew died at their station. Drowning men don't just sit calmly at their posts and wait to die. They fight for their lives with every ounce of strength they possess. But if the crew of the HL Hunley didn't drown that night, what the hell happened to them? Like most civil wars, the American Civil War was largely fought on land. Largely, but not entirely. Early on, President Abraham Lincoln, leader of the Union forces, realized that whoever held the Atlantic coast would control key trade and resupply routes to the east. In 1861, Lincoln implemented a vast naval blockade against the southern states. It was extremely effective, and the Confederates were soon looking for ways to break through. The question was how. There was no hope of beating Lincoln's fleet head-on. The Union not only had more ships, they had more shipyards to build new ones. If the Confederates wanted to break Lincoln's blockade, they were going to need to get creative. They say that desperation is the mother of all invention, and in 1863, Old Mother Desperation gave birth to the attack sub. Ouch. Before it became part of military history, the name HL Hunley belonged not to a submarine, but to a man who was instrumental in developing it, Horace Lawson Hunley. The submarine that inherited his name after his untimely death, more on that in a minute, was incredibly basic by modern standards. In earlier designs, Hunley and his partners toyed with the idea of powering the submarine with a small steam engine. But given the time and technology constraints, in the end they settled for a significantly less high-tech source of propulsion: manpower. The Hunley was designed for a crew of 8 men, 1 to fill the role of captain, and 7 to power the hand crank that turned the propeller. With 7 men simultaneously cranking one out, the sub had a sprightly top speed of about 4 knots, the equivalent of a brisk walking pace for us landers. Conditions for the men inside were brutal. You can see from this picture just how small the internal space was. The men couldn't even sit fully upright as they worked the crank. Just like the sub itself, the torpedo was very basic. To be honest, it was pretty much just a bomb on a stick. There was no propulsion system, so the only way to actually use it was to get in close and stick it to the hull of the target ship. Despite its simplicity, early tests were promising. In July 1863, the Hunley successfully sank an old coal barge anchored in Mobile Bay in front of a certain Admiral Franklin Buchanan, the only full admiral in the entire Confederate fleet. He was so impressed, he sent the sub to the key port city of Charleston by rail with a plan to use it against the Union blockade. Unfortunately, this early success was not to be